You may recall that in 2022, the United States passed the CHIPS Act, which was aimed at securing America's access to advanced semiconductors. There was a lot of money that was allocated to build fabrication facilities here in the United States, and that amount of money really tilted the market. Every company was asking for cash to support operations here in country. It's probably too soon to say whether or not these subsidies are really going to work out. And there's also a change of administration coming up in 2025 that could impact the way that this money is being sent out to these companies. But I think it's safe to say that there's more fabrication facilities that are being built here in the United States than there ever have been. Companies like Intel, TSMC, Samsung, Micron, and many others are expanding. But who's going to build these facilities? Who's going to work in them? And once they're completed, what kind of chips are they going to make? We're definitely going to be watching in 2025 as construction finishes up and these fabrication facilities start to come online. But Stephen, walk us through why there was such a big race to get as much money as possible out of the CHIPS Act.
Well, who doesn't want free money? That's the truth for all of these companies. I think I'll start actually by talking about the fact that the Chips and Science Act, which is the big guy, is almost actually over $200 billion. But if we just look at the chips portion, the part that underscores the semiconductor industry, that guy is about $52 billion, which includes about $39 billion in subsidies and the rest to support research, training, and so on. Now, it wasn't clear exactly where that money would come from, when it would come online, who would get what, et cetera. But over the course of the year, it was very much clarified, as well as the impact of this money. Now, that is a lot of money. And it's enough, as we said, to tilt the entire industry, the entire semiconductor manufacturing industry toward the United States. Other countries have their own CHIPS subsidies acts, but they have not been as successful. As we mentioned, Intel seems to be slow rolling their Israel rollout. There was a semi-fab in Germany that was rolled back a little bit or delayed. But here in the US, things are moving forward fairly quickly. Now, we did start by hearing that TSMC was going to delay a second fab in Arizona because they were lacking enough funding, but also because they were concerned about staffing. And that is a story, I think, that is not getting enough press. These factories are fairly automated, but they don't run themselves. And in addition to building the buildings and filling it up with equipment, you also need people to come in and run all that. And we'll see ultimately if that does happen. Now, Intel's portion of the CHIPS Act was the first part to be clarified back in March. Intel's whole package was about $19.5 billion. Unfortunately, as we learned the day before Thanksgiving, as I mentioned earlier, about $7 billion of that is tied to Intel actually being the company that's going to be owning and operating those fabs. So that does throw a spanner in the works of what Wall Street might want to do in terms of spinoffs and so on. It doesn't mean that they won't be able to IPO this stuff or sell minority stake or something, but ultimately Intel needs to be the one that's actually building and running those fabs if they are going to get the entire package. Now, over the year, we learned that, kind of who would get other amounts of money. TSMC, for example, was able to get $6.6 billion to fund their expansions in Arizona. Micron got $6 billion as well. Other companies were also subsidized by this, and ultimately the entire package was pretty much clarified by the end of the year. Another interesting aspect was the clarification that we got in July that the government is going to be working on helping to build skilled workforces to fill these facilities with workers once they're actually up and running. This is a major problem. There are not enough people in the US with the kind of skills that are needed to run and maintain and operate these factories. And no matter how much wishful thinking and no matter how much subsidies they get to build these buildings, if there aren't workers, there's not going to be anything that's going to happen there. So we are going to see at least some support for that. Now, at the same time, the reason for the U.S. Investing so much money in the CHIPS Act became remarkably clear as the trade wars between China and the U.S. continued to grow. As we talked about earlier, China decided that Intel and AMD chips weren't suitable for use in domestic computers. And they also started lobbing accusations that perhaps there was problems with American memory chips that impacted Micron back a little while ago, as well as throwing around suggestions that maybe they would restrict access to materials, metals, and raw minerals and things like that. We also saw escalation of the U.S. restricting access from Chinese companies to advanced processors, GPUs, and things like that. And all of this shows what's happening in the industry. And again, why Intel is going to be so pivotal to this story. Because at the end of the day, Intel got more money from the CHIPS Act than anyone. Intel is trying to leapfrog TSMC in the manufacturing race. TSMC and Samsung and Micron and many others are also involved. But ultimately, it comes down to Intel, whether they're able to roll out their 18A process and whether they're able to get customers and actually build these chips in the US. And another thing that I'll bring up too about the CHIPS Act that I think deserves mention is that we are not entirely sure what's going to happen next. So it's all well and good to actually manufacture chips in the US, but what about packaging those chips? What about processing them? Does that require them to be shipped overseas? Again, well, right now the answer is kind of yes. We'll see long term what this means, whether all of the associated industries are going to be here so that the US will actually be able to build entire semiconductors, entire systems on chip here in the US. That's not entirely clear either. So it's a lot of money, it's a lot of investment, and we'll see what happens. Plus, as we mentioned, the next administration is going to come in. They're going to take a look at this. Now, the horse is already out of the barn on a lot of this funding. There's not a lot that they're going to be able to claw back. I should also mention that a lot of this money goes to support jobs in what they call red states, basically the states that voted for Trump. So despite the fact that there have been rumors that the new administration is opposed to the CHIPS Act funding and that they want to undercut it somehow, they probably won't, simply because politics says it's not good business for them.